Good morning. My name is Gail Agrawal, and I am the dean of this marvelous law school. So on behalf of all of us in the Boyd Law Building, I extend a warm welcome to each of you. A special welcome home to Ozan Verrill from our class of 2007, now a member of the faculty at Lewis and Clark Law School. I can't see him, but I know he's in this room, probably hiding. There he is, hiding, who is presenting for the second time today. So we're really excited about that. We have also missed our faculty colleague, Sasha Somek, who is spending the year at Princeton, but he's been enticed to come home to join us for this meeting and the conference. So that's exciting too. As most of you know, the Iowa College of Law has a long and strong tradition of teaching and scholarship in comparative and international law. Our records reflect that we offered our first course in international law in 1885, just 20 years after our founding. And today, more than a third of our full-time faculty and many more instructors, lecturers, and adjuncts devote substantial amounts of their professional time to comparative and international law. We also can brag about a semester-long study abroad program in London, which is now more than 25 years old, where we lead a consortium of law schools in bringing students to that program, and a long-standing summer program in Arcachon. If you take a look in the library, I noticed that optional tours were at the end of the conference. You will see that its collection really reflects this long and deep tradition of comparative and international law here at Iowa, as does the fact that we have a student-edited journal of Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems, which is a host of today's conference, also more than 25 years old. We're proud that our colleague John Wrights is the current president of the American Society of Comparative Law. I saw some of you wandering around our hallways this morning, and you will have seen portraits of a lot of folks. Some of them might have been familiar faces to you. We have a tradition here that when someone is taught for 25 years, their portrait is commissioned and hung on the wall. John's has recently been finished. I've seen a peek at it, although it's not been unveiled, and it gave me a smile to see that in it he is holding a globe, which seems very, very appropriate. And while I'm on the subject of portraits, yes. Professor Adrienne Wing, also in the audience, is, I hope, working with her artist, who happens to be someone personally connected to her. On her portrait, she will be the first African-American woman to grace our portrait hall, so we're also really excited about that. So it's a treat for us to hold the 2012 annual meeting of the Society. We're looking forward to the conference, Judicial Review Between Promise and Chagrin. I think it's fair to say, some of you will know, that here in the state of Iowa, we have some experience with both of those points on the spectrum. So I will congratulate now the editorial board of TLCP and John Carlson, their faculty advisor, for what promises to be another highly successful symposium. Thank my colleagues once again, John Wrights and Adrienne Wing and Sasha Somek, for all their work on the meeting and the conference. I hope you enjoy the day and your time in Iowa City, and I expect to see you around the hallways and in some of the sessions. So thank you again for joining us. I will turn it over.
Thank you very much, Gail. So let me invite our speakers for the first panel to come down, Paul Gowder and Ran Hirschl. I'll just, while they're coming down, I'll just make a few organizational remarks. First of all, most important of all, if you're wondering how the building works or where to get something or who you should talk to about something, the idea of these yellow tags was that all the students have yellow tags, the faculty members here have them. Now, unfortunately, also all the speakers have them, so the speakers may be confused. So look for a younger person, although we have some very young speakers here too, so maybe I can't use that. Maybe that's an invidious category to use. Anyway, you can try the people with yellow tags. Many of them should be able to help you if you need any assistance. And in particular, out at the desk, there'll be some, my secretary is out there quite a bit, and also the head of the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, Zach Hengst, and so they can help you. I'm not going to give a long introduction here because you have, for each of our speakers, because you have the speaker bios in your packets. If you don't have, if you're not a part of the conference and you don't have the conference packet, we do have copies of the speaker bios and also the background reading that I gave you. Someone said I gave you homework last night. Which probably most of you handle the way your students do. But there are stacks of those things out, I guess, out on the table coming in. So please help yourself. But we are really privileged to have two very fine speakers to start this panel off, to start this conference off. So we have Ron Hirschl from Toronto, and Paul Gowder, who actually is here on our own Iowa faculty. And I've told them that their task is to sort of set the problem up for us by helping us understand the pros and cons, the dangers and the promises of judicial review. And just to give you a little sketch of the arc of the conference, so the middle panel of the substantive panels devoted to this topic will be kind of gathering the experience from around the world, which promises to be somewhat hair-raising. And then the final panel will be a kind of a juxtaposition of the relationship of, the use of judicial review in the international sphere and the questions that raises with regard to the relationship with democracy, and then the interesting contrast with China, where more or less the same thing is going on, an attempt to have judicial review without democracy. So I'm going to keep the timing here. I've asked our speakers to be as brief as they can, but I'm giving them a little bit of leeway because we wanted the first panel to really get the problematics out for us, but roughly 20 minutes or thereabouts, because I anticipate that a lot of you will have a lot to say about this topic. So let's get started.
All right, so I don't know, I'm too tall for this. We'll see how it works. So first of all, thank you all for coming, and thanks to John and Sasha for putting together such an interesting program on a timely and topical issue, and of course for the invitation. Those of us who follow comparative law in continental Europe normally tend to treat comparative law as comparative private law, and I'm delighted to see that the association is interested in comparative public law and judicial review, constitutionalism, which is what I and many people here do. So I'm delighted to be here to speak on the problems and perhaps some promise of judicial review. So obviously this is a broad topic. I cannot possibly, even both of us cannot possibly even scratch the surface of it. What I want to do is just to make maybe 3 or 4 bold statements as to the actual impact of judicial review beyond the legal arena, and then I take it my co-panelists will take us in a more philosophical direction, and then we'll see where this goes. So first of all, just to set the record straight for those of us who don't follow the developments, the past few decades have seen sweeping global convergence towards democracy, real or professed, alongside a convergence upon constitutional supremacy and, of course, the corresponding increase in the political salience of constitutional courts and judicial review worldwide. Over 150 countries and supranational entities covering approximately 3/4 of the world's population have gone through major constitutionalization processes over the last few decades. Countries such as Canada, Israel, Britain, and New Zealand described merely 2 or 3 decades ago as the last bastions of Westminster-style parliamentary sovereignty, have embarked on a comprehensive constitutional overhaul aimed at introducing principles of constitutional supremacy into their respective political systems. The rise of judicial review worldwide has been accompanied and reinforced by an almost unequivocal endorsement of the notion of constitutionalism and judicial review by scholars, jurists, and activists alike, and for all the right reasons. According to the generic version of this canonical view, judicial review by constitutional courts is a necessary supplement and a core element of a viable democracy. So the philosophical critique of judicial review and its democratic credentials, I would humbly suggest, probably we'll hear otherwise in 20 minutes, has been discussed and debated ad nauseum, and I think has been exhausted. To talk about the counter-majoritarian difficulty, I think we've heard enough of it. And if you're interested in this, read Jeremy Waldron and Mark Tushnet on one hand, and many others on the other, and read Stephen Gardbaum's book on the dialogue thesis, and in the Commonwealth model of judicial review, and you have it. What I think is missing badly from the discussion is empirical evidence at the is, not ought level, pointing to a connection between judicial review and democracy, development, and overall betterment of the human condition. The sharp increase in the sheer number of polities featuring vibrant judicial review alongside international conversation among scholars and jurists aided by new information technologies has generated a considerable knowledge bank now about the many different constitutional systems of countries around the world. And thanks to this rich body of information, it is now possible, perhaps for the first time, to draw on comparative research to test concrete hypotheses and to formulate generalizable insights concerning the actual practice and effects of judicial review. So my first claim here is that a serious dialogue between ideas and evidence, theory and data must now replace or at least complement the largely exhausted debate about the questionable democratic credentials of judicial review. So how necessary, let alone sufficient, a condition is active judicial review, strong or weak, in accomplishing high levels of democracy, human development, and other such great ideals? Of course, an exhaustive empirical study of the effects of constitutionalism and judicial review on democracy is beyond the scope of this very brief presentation. That said, some crude yet valuable information is easily available. Let's pick one such one highly regarded index of democracy. The Democracy Index, conducted by The Economist, is a very detailed and comprehensive index with 5 general categories of democracy: electoral processes, civil society, civil liberties, functioning of government, and all sorts of other things. It's constantly relied upon by the UN and other organizations. Regimes are assigned a score of 0 to 10 on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 is the closest the country can get to a full democracy. North Korea scored 1.08 on a scale of 1 to 10, and Norway 9.8, so as close as it gets to the other end, the highest result. The rest of the top dozen countries include Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Switzerland, Canada, and the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Ireland. The US was ranked 17th with a score of 8.18. None of the top 12 countries on the list sport a long tradition of US-style written constitutionalism, active judicial review, or a culturally ingrained constitutional sanctity. Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark, 4 of the most developed and prosperous nations on earth, have long adhered to a relatively egalitarian conception of democracy, while being less than enthusiastic, to put it mildly, towards the American notion of rights and judicial review. Has this come at the expense of utter disregard for civil liberties in these countries? Hardly. The sections on alleged human rights violations in any of the Scandinavian countries are slim to non-existent in all the international human rights watchdog reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. The status of individual freedoms in the Netherlands, one of the European countries that until recently had stringently opposed the idea and practice of judicial review, certainly has not been lower than in the US. Which obviously has had more than 2 centuries use of widely celebrated Bill of Rights and 2 centuries of active judicial review. So as Robert Dahl, the great theorist of democracy, skeptically observed 20 years ago, and I quote, "No one has shown that in countries such as the Netherlands, which lack judicial review, or in Norway or Sweden, where it is exercised rarely and in highly restrained fashion, or in Switzerland, where it can be applied only to cantonal legislation, are less democratic than the US, nor, I think, could one reasonably do so." So another way of assessing the significance of constitutional provisions or judicial review per se is by looking at their contribution to human development. So the Human Development Index compiled by the UN, so the Human Development Index, the HDI, is a widely recognized metric combining standardized measures of life expectancy, literacy, educational attainment, GDP per capita for countries worldwide. The most recent Human Development Report 2011 again ranks Norway at the top with a score of 0.938. That's on a scale of 0 to 1. Followed by Australia, New Zealand, the US is 4th, Ireland, Liechtenstein, the Netherlands, Canada, and Sweden. With the exception of Japan, humble constitutionalism and limited judicial review, and the US, extravagant constitutionalism and great judicial visibility, none of the world's most populated countries are among the world's leaders in terms of human development. So Mexico, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, India, and China all are making important strides, but do not, generally speaking, excel in terms of HDI, human development indicators. What is the net impact of the variance on the judicial review axis throughout all of this? Quite negligible, frankly. So we cannot point in any concrete direction. In other words, rights and judicial review alone certainly do not do the trick when it comes to human development. They may not even be an across-the-board necessary supplement to democracy. Even more fundamentally, comparative data suggests that factors such as manageable population size, high education and human capital, a developed market economy alongside a functional social safety net, and strong state capacity above all, account for democracy, prosperity, and human development more than written constitutionalism per se, active judicial review, or the legalization of social relations. Now, constitutions and active judicial review matter, and certainly in so-called difficult places, and we can go there in a minute. However, their net significance is often exaggerated by overly legalistic accounts, while the significance of the social and political context within which judicial review operates is often downplayed. Let me also illustrate this particular point from another angle through the perspective of social and economic rights, positive rights, second-generation rights. So in Brazil, as many of us know, Lula, as he's known, assumed the presidency on January 1st, 2003, and stayed in office until 2009. Has been advocating a socialist progressive agenda. His administration introduced throughout those 6 years a series of social policies and new spending priorities aimed at eradicating poverty and illiteracy in Brazil. The results have been nothing short of staggering. From 2003 to 2009, the number of poor people in Brazil dropped from 58 million to 41 million, while the overall population increased from 176 million to almost 200 million. The Gini coefficient, this is the measurement of equality, inequality. The Gini reading fell from 0.581 to 0.544. The closer you are to 1, the less equal you are. The illiteracy rate dropped from 13% to less than 10%, and the infant mortality rate per 1,000 live birth fell from 36 to 22. All this in 6 years. Most significant for our purposes, the social and economic rights provisions in the Constitution of Brazil or the status of judicial review in Brazil have not changed a bit since 1988. So from 1988, we have pretty much the same constitutional framework, the same establishment of judicial review and constitutional system. Comes this progressive leader with a bunch of targeted policies, and within 6 years accomplishes all those things. I wanted to say a few words about other elements of social and economic rights, but perhaps we can leave that for the Q&A, because I have a couple of other things to say. But the same goes to South Africa with its widely celebrated positive rights jurisprudence, and for all the right reasons from a jurisprudential standpoint, it's absolutely groundbreaking. And we will hear later this afternoon about recent developments in that country. But the reality is that South Africa's Gini index rose from 0.59 in 94 to 0.65 in 2005 to 0.71 in 2010, despite all this widely celebrated positive rights jurisprudence and backlash against it and all those things. So what's the bottom line of that aspect? To be sure, the sweeping worldwide convergence to constitutionalism and judicial review has brought about tremendous advantages and advances, real and symbolic, in the legal protection and public awareness of basic rights and liberties. And it has certainly entrenched in the public mind the notion that there is far more to democracy than a mere adherence to the majority rule principle. Judicial review may certainly foster civility, as it were, in less than amazing spots of the world. That said, simple and sweeping claims about the positive effects of the constitutionalization of rights and judicial review ought to be taken with a grain of salt. Whereas the constitutionalization of rights, the practice of judicial review, no doubt affirm marginalized identities or promote the status and awareness of procedural justice and negative liberties. Its independent influence on promoting progressive notions of democratic or distributive justice appears somewhat exaggerated. Another point I want to make is the impact of judicial review on the way politics is conducted throughout the world, or, if you want to call it a different way, the judicialization of pure politics, of mega politics throughout the world following the establishment of strong judicial review. This is one of the most significant phenomena in late 20th and early 21st century government. It is the tremendous growth worldwide in the reliance on courts for dealing with some of the most fundamental political quandaries a polity can contemplate. The judicialization of politics worldwide has expanded its scope beyond the fleshy rights issues to encompass what we may term mega politics, matters of outright and utmost political significance that often define and divide whole polities. Core political controversies are framed as predominantly constitutional ones, with the concomitant presumption that courts are the suitable forum to deal with them. So we have the question of Quebec and the future of Canada. What is the exact meaning of Israel's self-definition as a Jewish and democratic state? Issues we will hear more about later today and tomorrow, such as the legitimacy of the German bailout deal. The German Federal Constitutional Court just rendered a major decision on this a few weeks ago. German sovereignty and the Treaty of Lisbon, another big decision from 2009. The validity of Russia's accession to the WTO just 2 months ago. The dollarization plan in Argentina. Disqualification of political parties in Turkey and Belgium and Spain and you name it. The scope of Islamic law as the source of legislation that we will hear more about later today. Whether sending Korean, as in South Korea, troops to Iraq is constitutionally legitimate. Whether violation of term limits by incumbent leaders in Colombia, Uganda, and Venezuela, just a short list, is fine. And the list goes on and on and on. And so the establishment of judicial review created a framework that is conducive, it's a bare minimum, hospitable to the judicialization of those pure political questions that at least in theory, ought to be dealt with first and foremost at the political sphere, at least in an ideal world. So, with all that in mind, an overwhelming body of evidence suggests that there are important extrajudicial factors that play a key role in a constitutional court decision-making patterns. Constitutional courts and judges may speak the language of legal doctrine, consciously or not. However, their actual decision-making patterns are correlated with, at least to a large extent, with policy preferences, ideological and attitudinal tilts, as well as appearing to reflect strategic considerations vis-a-vis their political surroundings, panel composition, professional peers, or the public as a whole. This can be explained by reference to the cost that judges as individuals or courts as institutions may incur as a result of adverse reactions to unwelcome decisions, or through the various benefits that they may acquire through the rendering of welcome decisions. So we have a wide array of empirically grounded studies suggest that harsh political responses to unwelcome activism or interventions on the part of courts, or even the credible threat of such a response, can have a chilling effect on judicial decision-making patterns. Variations on the same logic have been used to compellingly explain judicial behavior in countries as varied as Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Pakistan, Canada, Russia, South Africa, Taiwan, Georgia, and so on. I'll be there. We can speak about specific examples in the Q&A if you wish. It is also interesting to look at how judicial review is established or curtailed by influential political forces. In Mexico, Israel, and other places, judicial review has been, I don't want to say created, but was strengthened significantly due to interests of political leaders or elites or political parties under threat. On the other hand, as we will hear later today, the Chief Justice of Afghanistan was replaced by Karzai because he did not deliver the goods in 2006. As we will hear later today, major constitutional turmoils in Russia, Hungary, and Romania. In Ecuador, yes, there is such a place. In Ecuador, on 3 separate occasions from 2004 to 2007, the Constitutional Court was dismissed altogether. So this entire talk, sterile talk, abstract talk about judicial review, I would submit, is detached from political realities out there. And at any rate, the likelihood of a constitutional court or judicial review in a given polity that long hold to norms of rights of justice that are substantially at odds with the rest of the political elite in that country is quite small. Either way, to conclude that aspect, the introduction of judicial review turned a national high courts into key political actors. Just one final point I'll make. There seem to be some ideological links yet to be fully fleshed out between the small state economic and social thought prevalent in the decades prior to the economic meltdown of 2008 and the prevalent conceptualization of rights as essentially negative liberties that shield the private sphere from the long arm of the encroaching state. The dominant notion of rights as negative freedoms is based on a view of society as composed of largely unencumbered, autonomous, self-sufficient private sphere, whose members' full realization of freedom is constantly threatened by the encroaching state. In fact, it is difficult to find even a single recent example in the industrial world, at least, perhaps with the exception of post-World War II Germany, where the rise of judicial review and individual rights discourse has been associated with an expansion, not decline, of corporatism, organized labor, or the welfare state. So that's interesting. And in terms of negative rights jurisprudence or rights jurisprudence statistics, negative rights, as in calls for less state, account for, by, if you do comparative studies, 85 to 90% of rights claims throughout the West, with approximately 40% wins and 60% losses. When it comes to positive rights, workers' rights, group rights claims, all those rights, it's 10 to 15%. And of all the rights claims with approximately 20% wins. So the difference in absolute numbers is quite large. 40% of 85% is roughly 35%, and 20% of 15% is 3%. So the bottom line is, of all those percentages, there are more than 10 times more negative rights wins than wins of any other kind. And of those negative rights or procedural rights wins, approximately 2/3 are criminal due process rights throughout the world. This is not just an American phenomenon, it's throughout the world. To conclude, all said and done, it remains unclear whether active judicial review has the capacity to plant the seeds of social change, whether it simply reflects ideological, cultural, and social change, or perhaps even prevents true change by its embedded inclination towards judicious, balanced solutions within the pre-existing legal framework and against perceptions of the good that do not regard protection of the rule of state law, procedural fairness, or formal equality as the ultimate constitutional or political goal. And the answer is probably all of the above. The global expansion of judicial review is a major phenomenon. Any serious assessment of the actual effects of this transformation must go beyond the largely abstract debate on the democratic credentials of judicial review. You're in the hot seat. To address the de facto concrete impact of judicial review on various aspects of social, economical, and political life. Judicial review per se is certainly not a bad thing, but its concrete, real, supposedly all-encompassing positive impact seems exaggerated and based on a study of only a handful of cases and is largely empirically unsubstantiated. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ran. That was exactly what we wanted you to do, challenge us. And of course, I should have mentioned that Ran is primarily a political scientist, and so it's quite understandable that he called for empirical research. A lot of us don't know what to do with empirical research, and so I think it's important that for us to consider both the empirical side and the abstract or theoretical side, and for that, my colleague Paul Gowder is going to help us out.
Yes, with apologies to Ron, I'm afraid that I am going to spend some time with the abstract, sterile, and disconnected from political reality side of the debate. And even worse, I'm going to talk about the dead counter-majoritarian problem, and I hope to convince you that the problem is not dead, or at least the problem won't be dead until I finish killing it. So, first, I'd like to raise the three different different ways of formulating this objection, and I'll argue that only the third need detain defenders of judicial review. And I actually would like to discuss a way to understand judicial review as a majoritarian institution that may tentatively and partially, because the problem's not dead, answer the one functioning version of the counter-majoritarian problem. But first, some thoughts about scope. There's a big tent of democratic objections to judicial review. It's not just the counter-majoritarian problem. For example, I take the remarks we just heard about the judicialization of politics to be another significant democratic objection to judicial review, the claim that litigation is a substitute rather than a complement for democratic action. And I think Ron has an extraordinarily good point with reference to the need for empirical work in that domain, because only empirical work can tell us whether litigation and politics are in fact substitutes or complements, whether, for example, the extent to which judicial review suppresses political activism is counterbalanced by the extent it promotes political activism by giving those opposed to a result something to fight against, those in favor of it something to defend, as with backlashes in places like South Africa, or indeed in the US with respect to Roe versus Wade and the gay marriage cases, a point for which I should thank my colleague Stella Elias, by the way. But theorists like me, abstract, sterile, can get some more traction
Don't
on
take it personally.
a little personal.
Yeah. Sterile is good.
It's clean.
It's clean.
Yeah. We can get some more traction on the main line of democratic objections to judicial review, this counter-majoritarian problem. And stated in abstract terms, the idea is that judicial review, of course, is objectionable because it substitutes the illegitimate authority of politically unaccountable judges for the legitimate authority of democratic majorities. But stated in abstract terms like that, it's not clear what precisely the counter-majoritarian complaint actually is. And so I'd like to consider three possibilities. First, the complaint might just be that the policy will of a democratic public has been thwarted. The people wish to implement policy X in their capacity as sources of democratic authority, but some meddling judges tell them that they can't. And a lot of talk from critics of judicial review sounds exactly like that. Indeed, and for those who know me, you know where I'm about to go, this thwarting complaint was behind what has to be the very first critique of judicial review in recorded history. In 406 BC, the Athenian Assembly, acting in its sovereign democratic capacity, illegally executed several generals at whom they were mad after what was essentially a show trial. And one Athenian citizen tried to stop this early act of attainder. He attempted to bring an indictment for an illegal proposal against the leaders of the mob, an indictment which, incidentally, itself would be tried by a citizen jury with just as much democratic legitimacy as the assembly. Nonetheless, to hear Xenophon tell the story, the mob responded with exactly this thwarting complaint, crying, "How dare you tell the people they cannot do whatever they please," and intimidated the one conscientious citizen into backing down. And merely to utter that story is to reveal the problems with the thwarting version of the counter-majoritarian complaint. The trial of the generals was illegal. If the rule of law means anything, it means that the governing body of a political community, democratically legitimate or otherwise, is not free to just casually ignore the law when it finds it expedient. And rejecting the thwarting complaint does not entail denying that the democratic public or legislature in question ultimately retains full control over its laws. It just amounts to denying that the democratic public gets to exercise its control retroactively by ignoring the laws it has already enacted. The Athenian Assembly could have enacted a law. From now on, if our generals make us mad, we may give them summary mass trials and then execute them. But they didn't. They wanted to execute these generals right now. And so rather than prospectively changing the law, they ignored it. And so I'll submit to you that the thwarting complaint fails in any society committed to the demands of both democracy and the rule of law. It may survive if we think that judges are insufficiently constrained by law. If we think their decisions are just nakedly political, it becomes a complaint about judges' policy preferences supplanting those of citizens. But assuming that they're at least somewhat constrained by law, the thwarting complaint simply has to fail. But this leads into the next version of the complaint, which takes the majoritarian part of the counter-majoritarian problem seriously. So my previous point was that democratic publics retain ultimate authority to change the law prospectively, and that's perfectly consistent with judicial review. But an objector may cry out, no, they don't, at least not in many countries in which the rules are entrenched in constitutions requiring things like supermajorities. And really, this is an objection to the dead hand of yesterday's legislature getting to control today's. But that insight or point or simple recognition allows us to see how this entrenchment complaint can also be quickly disposed of. It's not an objection to judicial review. Judicial review and constitutional entrenchment need not go together. A state may have an entrenched constitution enforced by the people themselves, as actually was the case in Athens a few years after the trials of the general, when they entrenched their fundamental laws. Or a state may have an unentrenched constitution enforced by judges. The U.S. state of California's constitution is like that. Its Supreme Court strikes down laws all the time, and then routinely the people of California reverse the Supreme Court's rulings by putting amendments on the ballot and enacting them on simple majority vote. And so those who accept the entrenchment complaint seem to be committed to accepting judicial review in California and rejecting Athenian constitutionalism, notwithstanding its populist bona fides. This leaves the third version of the complaint, which is about the fact that it is judges who are determining when the people are breaking their own laws. The objection isn't to the review, it's to the judicial. And this version of the complaint asks, aren't the people perfectly capable of interpreting their own fundamental law? This complaint is distinctively associated with popular constitutionalists like Tushnet and Kramer, but I think the strongest version draws on Jeremy Waldron's claim that writing judicial review into a constitution represents a lack of respect for one's fellow citizens. And to fill the claim out, perhaps by taking the power of constitutional interpretation away from the people and giving it to judges, we express distrust either for our fellow citizens' ability or for their virtue. We deny that they either have the competence to interpret the law or the honesty and self-restraint to apply it in the face of a political desire to the contrary. And both of those attitudes are objectionable, not the least because they rest on false premises, some of which I take Ron's reference to the persistence of rights even in the absence of judicial review to show. On the competence point, more abstractly, ordinary citizens may not be capable of interpreting international tax treaties, but constitutional law is different. Many constitutions are best not understood in terms of technical legal doctrines, but as the repository of the fundamental values of the political community, values that the people are in at least as good an epistemic position to access as our judges, and probably in an even better position. And on the honesty and self-restraint point, any claims with which we might besmirch the public can just as easily be directed to the courts themselves. For Americans, I say, if you're on the right, I'll say Roe versus Wade. If you're on the left, I'll say Bush versus Gore, and then we're done. Moreover, those who would defend judicial review against the disrespect complaint must surrender some of their standard arguments. For example, the often heard claim that the courts ordinarily don't get too far from the policy preferences of the public is just a non sequitur. We don't care about the relationship on this version of the complaint between courts' legal rulings and the public's policy preferences. We care about the fact that it's the courts that are making these rulings and not the public, and that maybe the courts' legal rulings will differ not from the public's policy preferences, but from their legal judgments. So how do we defend judicial review against this, the strong version of the counter-majoritarian objection? And I think all is not lost, for this disrespect complaint fails to specify exactly how it is that the people themselves are to express their legal judgments and how they are to form them. We can't suppose that the public legal judgments will just be expressed through the medium of elected legislatures and executives, because part of the point of constitutional law is to forbid legislatures and executives from running afoul of the legal judgments of the people as expressed in the Constitution. Put differently, constitutional law partly exists to solve a principal agent problem between the people and elected officials. When Parliament starts trampling over people's rights, we can't just assume that Parliament's policy choices correspond to the legal judgments of the people. So, one solution to this problem would be to create full-fledged popular constitutionalist institutions. We could reinstate the Athenian citizen jury, in which the people themselves enforce their legal judgments on public officials, or consider the lay magistrates used in some countries. But this may not be the only option. Perhaps we can conceive of judicial review done by judges as not some intruder replacing popular legal judgments with those of a bunch of out-of-touch elites, but as an institutional tool for expressing and enforcing popular legal judgments. And some work has already been done in this area. There's a great 2009 paper by David Lord Washu arguing that the function of judicial review is to help solve this principal agent problem by serving as a coordination device to enable the public to resist unconstitutional behavior by other branches of government. The basic logic of this coordination account is that judicial review is a signaling device in a strategic equilibrium in which each citizen can rely on all other citizens' agreement to resist those official actions that the court says are unconstitutional. And this explains why judicial decisions are successfully enforced against other entities of government, despite courts having ordinarily neither the power of the purse nor of the sword, because the people accept judicial decisions as a way of expressing their otherwise incoherent collective interpretation of the Constitution. And this allows the people to solve two problems. First, that each may be uncertain whether or not others are willing to take a risk to resist unconstitutional behavior by the executive and legislature. And second, that they may disagree about what actually counts as unconstitutional. So I think this account has three very significant implications. First, if judges' decisions get enforced to the extent people are willing to treat them as a signal to resist the other branches, then that puts some upper limit on the extent to which judges' decisions can diverge too greatly from the decisions that the public itself, if it could act as a unitary entity, would make. Now, it's not clear how tight this limit is. There's a lot of potential wiggle room where people may be willing to support decisions they think are incorrect in order to avoid destabilizing the legal system as a whole. But there is some limit. Second, perhaps most interestingly for this conference, it suggests that there may be no functional difference between strong judicial review systems like the US and weak judicial review systems like the UK under the Human Rights Act Declaration of Incompatibility regime, in which judges can declare legislative action illegal but have no formal power to enforce that decision. In either system, the actual success or failure of a given act of judicial review on the coordination model depends on its power to coordinate public opposition to the acts of elected branches. And so if strong judicial review systems are functionally indistinguishable from weak judicial review systems, it follows that the former can't be any more objectionable than the latter. The third implication may ultimately make it possible for judicial review to count as a fully fledged popular constitutionalist institution. If the coordination account is right, we may be able to coherently deny that courts actually have ultimate legal authority, even as a theoretical matter, even in strong judicial review systems like the US. Rather, we should say that they have defeasible authority, subject to the ultimate imprimatur of the public. To see this, consider the position of an elected official who finds his or her decisions overturned by a constitutional court. I take it that such an official will experience herself as being imposed on by the courts. The courts impose a view of the law that the other official does not agree with. The president thinks it's constitutional for him to imprison accused terrorists without trial. The court disagrees, and the court gets its way. The president might fairly ask, and if you believe people like Larry Kramer, the president should ask, why should I have to accept the court's version of what the law is? And note that this is a different question from why should I obey the law? Because the president thinks in good faith that the law permits him to hold accused terrorists without trial. I submit that there are two things we might say to the president. Either, number one, the people are actually the authoritative expositors of the law, and the people assent to the Supreme Court's interpretation. Or two, there is no authoritative expositor of the law. However, in the face of irreconcilable legal disagreement, the people as the ultimate political authority must resolve the question, and they assent to the Supreme Court's interpretation. Either way, we can vest on a theoretical, abstract, sterile, disconnected from political reality level formal authority in the people themselves without changing anything about how judicial review actually works, again, even in strong judicial review countries. So a closing thought, this is still not completely satisfactory as an answer to the counter-majoritarian problem. Why? Well, because there's a principal-agent problem as well between the people and the judges. What is it to keep the judges from going right up to the amount of divergence from the public that they can get away with? In fact, this paper I mentioned, David Law claims that his strategic analysis entails entails that judges become even more powerful to the extent they can get away with enforcing decisions that the people reject. And if true, if disobedience increases judges' power, then this is surely a problem on democratic grounds. And maybe we could come up with some more strategic work to solve it. I'm actually working on a model right now that may eliminate this problem. But even so, the question remains, why should it be judges who serve this function? Even if judges can be made democratically acceptable, why do we need them? Why not, for example, reinstate the Athenian citizen jury for constitutional questions, which Dahl actually proposed in passing at one point? Couldn't a popular constitutional court serve the same function as judicial review without any lingering anti-democratic worries? And I'm not sure that I have a satisfactory answer to this yet. Two passes at it seem to suggest themselves. First is the standard argument that judges may be easier to insulate from pressure from elected officials than our citizen juries. Courts tend to be composed of socioeconomic elites. They can be, in some systems, given things like life tenure, etc. Second is we might appeal to the liberal ideal of the citizen who has other things going on in her life and who ought not to be needlessly drafted to serve in some kind of constitutional court. And this is a standard objection in political philosophy to Athenian models of democracy, that they're just too demanding on the labors of ordinary citizens. And if we limit the citizen jury to those who volunteer, self-selection effects could be a problem. And here I have to make one more Athens reference. Imagine the jury addict from the Wasps of Aristophanes, and imagine that person being in charge of constitutional law. I think that's the big open problem on the theoretical, abstract, sterile, disconnected level for judicial review. Not its defensibility, because to my mind the coordination model solves that, but its comparative advantage over potential directly popular alternative institutions. And that's where the research on this theoretical level needs to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Paul and thank you to Ron for getting us off to a very good start here. We've got some very controversial ideas here and new ideas, I think. And so now the floor is open and we have some time for some good discussion. So who would like to ask questions?
I needed a tagline.
Jim? I'll take Jim and then Kim. You want to go up to the mic? It might be helpful. I guess we have two mics here in the room. Kim, I'll put you next.
Certainly a very stimulating opener. I really enjoyed both presentations. I just wondered about the role of culture, both in the sense of legal culture and in the sense of the larger culture in explaining some of the variations that our first speaker referred to. I don't mean to be ironic, but I found some of the presentation very abstract in the sense of relying upon rankings and that sort of thing, and I kept wondering about the relationships, of course, among the various peoples of Canada and North Korea and Iceland and so on. And it might be that Swedish culture helps explain why there is a reluctance to rely upon judicial review. So I'm just wondering, of the first speaker in particular, what you see, Professor Hirschl, in this idea of both legal culture and a larger culture. Thank you.
Quickly
please, that? Please do. Yeah.
No, I think it's an excellent question. Let me just respond with the question. When people in this country and in other countries talk about the institution of judicial review, do they say American judicial review or they say judicial review, as if this is some sort of a generic phenomenon, that the way it has been practiced in this country is applicable to analyze the way it has been practiced elsewhere. So of course culture matters a great deal, and it may very well be that culture and political institutions of the welfare state or the Keynesian welfare state in Scandinavia explain why is it no judicial review is required there to accomplish the same goals. It may be required in other places where the culture or political ideology or whatever those fuzzy terms we want to define. I'm absolutely with you, and there's only that much I can address in what 15, 20 minutes, and it goes without saying that as with any standardized measurement of the same phenomenon across countries, you look at the forest and you lose many of the nuances and context and all those things. So I'm not suggesting these are not important. They may very well be important, but if we want to stick to context and details and culture, we ought to refer to judicial review as American judicial review or Canadian judicial review or British judicial review, and not to judicial review, because your comment is applicable to that account as it is applicable to my account.
Kim Shepley?
I'm not this tall.
Oh, heavens.
I can ask
Okay, I'll stand on my toes. Anyway, I have questions for both Ron and for Paul. So to Ron, so on one hand, I think it's really, I mean, as you know, I'm a great believer in empirical evidence, but in looking at most of your kind of democracy, human development index kinds of data, you know, what you might conclude is that the best way to do well on those scores is to have been in democracy for a long time. And of course, that's highly correlated with whether you have judicial review or not. So I'm wondering if that's really the right measure. So I guess what I would suggest is to think about whether judicial review is effective at what it actually purports to be effective at, which is defending a constitution, which is a slightly different thing than defending a democracy or defending an economy. Your Lula examples would be that. And so I guess it seems to me that if you look at just overall country well-being, there's so much enmeshed in what those figures reveal that I'm wondering if you can really disentangle the effects of judicial review from any of that. And then to Paul, I was going to make a similar kind of comment, which is I find this a really ingenious set of defenses, and I would love to have a written copy of your paper because I want to cite it. I think it's very helpful. And yet as I listen to you, I'm wondering whether your defense in some ways isn't more even nuanced than you say, which is that as you describe how judicial review works, and you describe the case for judicial review really being majoritarian and not counter-majoritarian, you describe judicial review as enmeshed in different kinds of political systems. So in some cases there's a referendum override, which gives you a kind of, you know, capacity to think that the ones that stand, actually the decisions that stand, are actually have some kind of majoritarian approval. You're describing political dynamics within which judicial review sits. So I'm wondering if you might want to further qualify your argument a little bit by saying that judicial review may be majoritarian depending on what the rest of the constitutional system looks like, right? And that you may need certain kinds of checks on judicial review itself for it to perform that function. Don't you think, to make it a question?
I guess I'm going first. I mean, all I really have to say is I agree completely. I think there are two distinct kinds of political institutions that judicial review would need to be embedded in to serve this kind of function. But because there are two functions. So function number one, constraining executives, they would need to be embedded in the sorts of institutions where the people have the ability to affirm or disaffirm court's rulings as against the executive. So we imagine, you know, executive defies the judiciary, the people vote the executive out, etc. So those institutions are obviously a prerequisite for this. But I think also the second issue is this principal agent problem between the people and the judiciary. And for that, then that's the open problem that David Law's paper leaves open. I'll give you a sneak preview of what I think my solution is. My solution is that in some situations, the other branches of the government can in turn invoke the authority of the people by defying the judiciary. Think of Andrew Jackson's great, the court has made its decision, now let them enforce it moment. I mean, great, evil, but in those circumstances, it seems to me that the executive can appeal to the people, and if the people send the executive back at the next election, that could be taken as an affirmation of the act of defiance. And so some institutional context permitting the people to ultimately speak to the correctness or incorrectness of the court's decision when the other branches think the court has gotten it wrong would also be necessary to support this theory.
Well, thanks, Kim, on your comment, which as Paul said, I absolutely accept. I'm not a proponent of using indices to measure the impact of judicial review. I just use this as a rhetorical tool to ignite the discussion, so to speak. With that said, of course, there are tons of nuances in that. But let's go back to your, I think, core principled question, which I think is important. Perhaps we should measure the impact of judicial review to the extent that we can measure it at all by assessing its ability to defend the Constitution. That is its stated goal. So let's measure that. So obviously it sounds like a simple question, a neat question, but then we run into all sorts of interpretation problems, what the Constitution means and all that. Let me just give two examples. Of course, in general, I accept what you say at the theoretical level, although it's difficult to do it on the ground. Let's illustrate this with two examples quickly that came to my mind. One is, so Canada is the relatively more progressive jurisdiction in North America. So not that there is much of a competition, but it's, but let's say there is, okay? So our Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects the right to life, and as in not the right of life in the context of abortion, but in the context of theoretically human dignity, positive rights, healthcare, education, all those things, yes, to decently. And as it happens, Section 21 of the Constitution of India is almost verbatim the same as Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So with that in mind, the Indian Constitution, the Indian Supreme Court, as many of us know, has interpreted fairly generously this Section 21. The wording is the same, so it's sort of natural experiment, right? Defending the Constitution. The wording is the same. Positive rights are, generally speaking, recognized by the Supreme Court of India as stemming from the Section 21, whereas the Supreme Court of Canada has, by and large, excluded that kind of interpretation and the protection of positive rights from the purview of Section 7. And to add another layer of complexity, we all know that Canadians are totally and completely committed to national health care, and one of the markers of identity of Canadians is, unlike our neighbors to the south, we have health care, and all that stuff. So this entire debate on health care in this country is perceived as some, really difficult to understand. I'm trying to be difficult to understand. So here is an example of the text itself is almost dissimilar, and the judicial institutions use judicial review to take it in all sorts of directions. Just quickly, another example along the same lines. So let's go to Pakistan. That's a cool place. Do we have to? I don't know, a minute. Let's go to Pakistan, yes. So you'd be surprised how, so there is judicial review in Pakistan. It's the Constitution is the Supreme Court is quite active and during some periods fairly independent. And so in '99 there is this military coup d'etat, and Musharraf comes to power. I don't know if you recall. And then there is a big case the Supreme Court of Pakistan is asked to determine whether this coup d'etat is constitutional. And the Supreme Court says, yes, it is. There's state necessity, state emergency. Absolutely, Musharraf is in power. Coup d'etat is legitimate. The same Supreme Court, 2008, at this time, Musharraf is in London, England, having fun there in exile. And the Supreme Court is asked to determine whether ousting of Chief Justice Chowdhury by Musharraf in 2007 was legitimate constitutionally. And of course, the same Supreme Court says, of course it was unconstitutional to oust Chief Justice Chowdhury. And who is the Chief Justice presiding over the court that says this? You got it. Chief Justice Chowdhury himself. And the entire decision is filled with judicial independence and this and that, and this is not personal, it's principled, and all those things. So, coup d'etat is constitutional. Coup d'etat, no less, is constitutional. Ousting of Chief Justice Chowdhury is not. I don't know. So, of course you're right, but ultimately it's all a matter of interpretation and the politics surrounding it.
All right, I've got quite a few people on the list here, and so let me try to get to everybody. Next one is this, yeah, you, sir.
Brian Ray.
Brian Ray.
And the question is for Professor Hirschl, and it's kind of a follow-up to Professor Shepley's question. And you've already said it was a rhetorical point, but I was going to say it seemed to me at least a little unfair to start with the question of whether judicial review is necessary to democracy, or I guess also necessary to human development. But I absolutely agree that these are empirical questions, and I wondered if it might be better or appropriate to take it not necessarily in the direction that Kim was taking it, to ask about generally whether judicial review is protected the Constitution, but to look at discrete areas. And it seemed to me you were doing a little of that when you talked about the predominance of criminal law or criminal protections. And the area that I'm thinking about is social rights. And I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. We can look at social rights and say countries that have them don't necessarily, in fact, generally don't do better than countries that don't. Although I think the South African example in particular, the domestic activists would say back to you, well, that's because the court's been just, absolutely at the wrong end of things. But we could look at specific things like the right to housing. And there in South Africa, for example, and very specifically on evictions, I think people would say, hey, what the court has done there, in fact, has pushed the government in very particular ways in rights protective directions. And then I guess the question then becomes, well, what accounts for that? Is it judicial review as an institution, or is it the fact that the court was able to operate in kind of the ways that Tanis Rue has identified because of the political environment? But in any event, I'm just curious about your thoughts, and also you sort of said you might talk more about social rights, and I'd be curious. And then for Paul, just curious how something like social rights could or would work in your framework. In other words, whether there are some dimensions to constitutionalism and rights in particular that might or might not work quite as well, or wouldn't quite fit into the framework that you're outlining. And so just wanted to get your thoughts there.
Could you say more about that, or why they might not fit in?
Well, so for example, it seems to me that when courts issue decisions in more technical areas, let's say, they're on the one hand reacting to, on the one hand, they're arguably getting more deeply involved than they should. So the legitimacy problem, the democratic problem gets heightened in that area because they're reacting to areas that the legislature either has more expertise and or greater democratic legitimacy. But at the same time, if we try to think about a kind of popular constitutionalist response to that, or to modify judicial review in a way that brings into play more of a popular, the people in some more direct way, it strikes me that those, at least the competency problems, get really, really heightened. So that,
right.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, again, I love having this moment in responding to comments where I can simply say I agree, and this happens to me fairly often. I mean, I think the reason is that the competency problem does start to tell when courts are being asked to make rulings in fairly technical areas. And there's a difference in the text of the Constitution between constitutions that are essentially abstract statements of values like the US and a number of the significantly more detailed and technical constitutions around the world. And it may be that the instantiation of popular constitutions review would be different in those countries. But nonetheless, it strikes me that to the extent that we conceive of a constitution as something other than ordinary law, particularly as something that is the repository of the fundamental values of the people, that ultimately the people have to be the ones who retain a general check-in authority to control it, even if it's the case that in the more technical dimensions of the way in which they've legally expressed their fundamental values, they may find themselves deferring more readily to the courts. I mean, it's a continuum, not a binary. So you can have direct involvement of the people that's very deferential to courts in technical areas and less deferential to courts in broad claims about, for example, liberty and equality.
Just quickly on your question on positive rights, I think there's a fabulous work by Donald Horowitz, whom we know from his work on constitutional design, but I'm referring to something earlier than that, maybe 77 or 78, on the actual impact of, it's American context, but the idea applies elsewhere, I think, on variance in the impact of constitutional decisions, impact on the ground, depending on enforcement powers and how distant or how large the gap is between the Supreme Court and the actual area it rules on. So on procedural justice, criminal due process and all those things, many of those rights, courts are in a position to enforce right in front of them. Inadmissibility of illegally obtained evidence, you don't need anyone. You just decide on it and you don't accept it, period. On positive rights, the distance, of course, I'm not saying anything new here, but the distance between the court and the actual implementation of these things on the ground is quite large. And it's not entirely clear how courts are in a position even to enforce those decisions to begin with. Now, with that said, I absolutely agree with you that some of these decisions in South Africa, in India is another interesting setting to study this, and in some other places, landmark constitutional court decisions on positive rights have had tremendous impact on the general spirit of activists and perhaps even on the ground changes. It just, to cut a general conclusion from those specific cases, I'll need to see more evidence. But you're absolutely right that those decisions are, their impact is much more. They ought to be understood as much more than the actual impact on the ground. They have some dramatic symbolic impact that may be more important than perhaps actual impact on the ground.
So I have at least 7 more people on the list right now, and we've got about 20 more minutes to discuss. So I wonder if maybe we should take about 4 comments first, and then the panel can respond to those. Francesca, you're the first one on my list. Did you still want to go? And then I have Ken Gallant. You're next, and then Maximo. So let's get those people to have their comments. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to ask what the both panelists thought that the debate on judicial review and whether or not it's a positive.
We're not hearing that.
Oh, so the debate on judicial review and whether or not it's a positive phenomenon itself reflects experiences with democracy. Because if you look at most of the rest of the world, it's not a huge issue, except for some of the common law countries, like with John Griffith and Carol Harlow in the UK and other places. But if you look at even places like Norway and Denmark, it's hard to see a huge debate on judicial review, and certainly core continental European countries and other places that I don't know about. So that's one question, whether or not the debate itself within the legal academy reflects historical conditions, just like democracy and judicial review are correlated, whether or not judicial review reflects that the debate on it reflects that history. So that's the question.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Ran a question, particularly about how one would go about quantifying the judicial review of positive rights on the ground. and I'm glad that you mentioned India. It's a place I know something about. 3 examples. The so-called affirmative action reservations, which have been implemented to a tremendous extent, the education decisions, where we now have near universal primary education in the south of India and very poor results in the north, and then the new Supreme Court emphasis on the right to the environment, which seems to me to be starting to succeed. And now, how would you set up a research program to measure the effectiveness of that and then compare it across other places where we have some sort of political failure that leads to enforcement of positive rights in the courts?
Okay, and Tim Sellers? And then Maximo.
Well, those were 2 very good and very interesting papers. The first paper suggesting empirical tests for whether judicial review advances the values that it's meant to serve, with the implication that one of these values is democracy. The second paper defending judicial review against democratic attacks, and again assuming the primary value of democracy. But what is in fact the purpose of judicial review? I think the value usually cited to justify judicial review is the protection that it offers against arbitrary government by empowering judges to interpret the law. And it does so most effectively when judges are independent, when they have long tenure, when they're well educated in the law. And this is very valuable, but it is not inherently democratic. Judicial review is not inherently democratic. I don't think it's usually intended to be democratic, nor is the development of wealth and happiness the main point of judicial review, nor is it intended to be. The main point of judicial review, as I understand it in the tradition that led to judicial review, is the prevention of oppression. And this is a very important role. The presence of a group in the institutions of power that is meant to be loyal to the Constitution, but also to law and to justice. In other words, a constraint on public and on private power. Isn't that useful in itself?
Okay, and then Maximo, and then we'll... Maximo.
Yes, I also enjoy the paper. So to run, my question is basically, so I totally agree with you, right? I mean, about looking into the empirics, and there is lots to do there. Do you see any normative payoff of the enterprise and what it would be, right? I mean, both in terms of, let's say, constitutional design and constitutional interpretation, right? And so I can see you saying at least 3 things to an answer like this, right? I mean, first, to a question like this is, first, well, I am a political scientist, I don't care, you lawyers figure it out, right? Second, well, all depends on context, right? So, it will be for the people of each individual place, to decide, right? Third, no, here there are some generalizations, some, generalizations that, given other variables that are present in a given society, right, we could make, right? And so you may not have these answers, you may have them, but is it there where, is that one of the places where that type of research, right, line of research and a way of rethinking about judicial review should be going, right? So that's the question. And then to Paul, the question is this, is to what extent your argument already assumes a liberal democracy, meaning, since it's a principal agent argument, to what extent your argument already assumes that the principal, right, has a preference for minimum liberal democracy values, right? I mean, what do you do with a case where, or cases where the principal actually has very liberal values, right? Think about anti-Semitism or any form of racial oppression, I mean, very liberal values, right? And so, Is there any, you know, how do we think about this? And another way to ask the question may be, and it may be an interesting thing in general, more in general when we're thinking about judicial review, is what are the limits of the right to self-determination, so to speak, right? You've been talking a lot about, you know, what are the problems or defenses of judicial review, but the counter, you know, one way to you know, the counter side of this, right, would be, okay, what are the limits, right, and problems that the self-determination as such presents?
Okay, well, it's a bit of a smorgasbord, but let's ask the panelists to respond to those.
Well, there's lots of stuff, from an attempt to design a PhD dissertation on India to I mean, all excellent questions. There's absolutely no way we can address any of those comprehensively in this forum. But let me just 2 or 3 bits. First of all, on Francesca's question. So I agree and disagree. I agree that most of the discussion on judicial review has been based on the experience of 2 to 6 countries, and on a good day. And so we need to look to other places to see what's going on, and perhaps you're right that this has not been an issue in other places, perhaps not, but we need to look to other places. So on that count, I'm with you. I respectfully disagree with your suggestion that this has not been an issue in many places. I think of course, it's a matter of level and degree, but if you follow constitutional politics or judicial politics in really remote places, you know, you will know that in the last 2 months alone, there has been a near coup d'etat in Papua New Guinea concerning the suspension of 2 Supreme Court judges, all based on all straightforward politics, right? Whether those support the government or not, and ongoing turmoil in Zimbabwe, and ongoing turmoil in Bolivia and Peru, and the list goes on and on. So it might very well be true, I'll take your word for it, than say in Austria or in Belgium this is not an issue. Maybe. But it is an issue in many places, and in Pakistan, I mean, without the Supreme Court, there is no government. We all read, I mean, Zardari needs to do this, Zardari needs to do that. It's ongoing all the time. In Egypt, that we will hear about later this afternoon, it's clear that the Supreme Constitutional Court is, or at least up until now, has not been a big fan of the new president. So we'll see what's going on. So the debate is not just about the democratic credentials of judicial review; it's the institution of judicial review in general. And I think this has been a fairly significant, maybe not, you know, on the India thing. I'll need to think about it. It's a very good question. I will say though that there have been quite a few works that attempt to do something like that. Not in India, not on positive rights, but something like that. And there are works, you know, anywhere from the blunt, hollow hope by Gerald Rosenberg that you can love or hate, but methodologically, forget the substance, methodologically there are some interesting ideas there, to works about the implementation of the European Court of Justice decisions throughout Europe, or European Union, and you can see with arguments ranging from, you know, because it serves the interests of elites in country X or country Y to implement those decisions, they do it. Because it does not, they don't do it. So we can go on and on about, it's a very interesting question of methodological design that goes well beyond the focus of our conversation here, I would think. On the last question of, so where is this going? So look, I think the focus on quote-unquote imperialist, power-hungry judges is completely wrong. The problem is with politicians. No judges can do long time adhere to judicial hyperactivism without the political sphere explicitly or tacitly supporting this. So the entire focus of this literature on how judges are imperialist and want, you know, usurp power and want more and more and don't know their boundaries and borders is completely off target. Without politics, nothing of this may be seriously explained. Well, not nothing of it, but most of it may not be explained. And so I don't know if it's normative, but my goal is, my understanding of the ultimate goal of this is to expose is not the right word, but to, let's say, expose, to understand what's the matrix of political motivations that drive the political sphere to delegate more power to the judicial sphere or to take away power from the judicial sphere. I'm less interested, obviously I'm a political scientist, less interested in, to me, the constitutional sphere per se is the well, dependent variable in this story, not the independent variable.
Okay, Paul, if you can be brief.
I will be brief. I have two very broad comments in response to the various remarks. First, in response to the first as well as the third comments, that the debate on judicial review reflecting experience with democracy and the claim that judicial review isn't meant to be democratic. I only want to point out that our conceptions of democracy are not only very historically contingent, but also very, very widespread even today. And so there are many perfectly sound conceptions of democracy that flat out require the rule of law, and not just for standard liberal reasons in which we assume that democracy requires inclusion and inclusion requires the rule of law. Two examples that are particularly interesting. Back to Athens. The Athenians, I have a paper showing, saw a strategic relationship between the rule of law and their democracy. That is, they saw the rule of law, and hence the power of their courts, as guaranteeing the ability of the lower classes who ran the democracy to protect themselves against powerful elites. On the other hand, today, in visiting Toronto for a while, David Dysenhouse, whose name I cannot pronounce, argues for a conceptual connection between these rule of law ideas and democracy. He essentially argues that legislatures are self-effacing to the extent they hand away power to arbitrary, unconstrained officials. It undermines their own democratic power. And so there are a lot of ways that we can conceive of the rule of law and hence the power of courts, maybe, as fundamentally necessary for democracy itself. And second point, in response both to the claim that judicial review isn't meant to be democratic and to the point that my argument may assume liberal democracy. So one way to defend judicial review is to take that strategy, to say democracy isn't all we care about, we also care about liberalism and or non-arbitrary power, and so judicial review preserves these things. And I agree, but I disagree with the strategy of making that the argument for judicial review because, as Ron pointed out, it's an empirical question whether we need judicial review to get these things. And I suspect that he's right to the tentatively suggesting that we don't always need judicial review as such to get these things. And so it would be intellectually unwise to rely on the claim that judicial review supplies them to defend it against democratic objections.
Okay, we have, I think, 3 or 4 more questions, and I think we just have time to get them out. Maybe a very quick response from the group. So, sir, you are next, I think. Next to Maximo, yeah.
Well, actually, Maximo's comment and Paul's response to it pretty much covered my point, which just very quickly to make it is, well,
and this is for Paul. I mean, the majoritarian defense that you make focuses on the principal agent problem, and that is well down the Hamiltonian line, the defense from Federalist 78. But of course, Madison makes the point that its principal agent problem is one aspect of judicial review, and the other is tyranny of the majority. Right? So you say that rule of law means that the people, and correctly say that it constrains the people in terms of they are required to make new laws if they want to do certain things. But of course, if they do make new laws in ways that, for example, empower the president to detain indefinitely because that's their view of the right political solution to this problem. I think what you're just saying is that you don't want to rely on that argument, but it obviously is a powerful argument against judicial review.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think when it comes right down to the bottom, ultimately the tyranny of the majority is always a possibility. The people can efface their courts. I mean, as Ron fundamentally pointed out, he's exactly correct about this. Judicial review is the dependent variable, where the independent variable is politics. And so, at best, judicial review can be a stopgap for the tyranny of the majority. It may be a valuable stopgap, but politics is ultimately the end.
Okay, Fred Morrison?
Pardon me. I was going to raise a different dimension of this. The dimension is an international one. For a lot of the countries you're talking about in your high lists, were Scandinavian countries, no judicial review, etc. But if you dig down deep in them, they're suddenly running up against the European Court of Human Rights on various little technicalities and so on. The ECHR has become, on the first generation rights, a very important judicial review organization, not only for Scandinavia, but for Eastern Europe. And what it reflects is an appeal from one demos to another. And it may be a way of institutionalizing things that renders the simple display you've been, the simple conflict you've been talking about sort of obsolete. Okay. And I would ask your comment on that.
Let's get one more comment out. Richard Stith, you're the last one on my list. I apologize if I missed anybody, but we're kind of running out of time.
Thank you very much. I actually wanted to introduce a complicated question of the tension between departmentalism and popular constitutionalism, but I'll drop all that. I just want to say one thing that's very interesting is there's been a consensus today, at least among our speakers, I'm not sure I understood all the questioners, that there's been opposition to judicial review and there's been in favor of, but as a mechanism for popular constitutionalism. No one has defended judicial supremacy today. So, but this, I think, is very, very much part of the ideology which is spreading and becoming dominant throughout the world. So how is, I think it's some kind of reliance on legal science in the background or something notion that the judges, no one has defended that conception, but we need to talk about that politically if we're going to be talking about the future of the world.
Yeah, okay, that's an excellent point to end on here. So
yeah, I think it's an excellent point of ending. So perhaps it's better to postpone to continue the discussion over tea or coffee. On the international, I don't know if this question was directed to me, but I will just say that you're right on, and certainly the emergence of supra/transnational human rights regimes, quasi-judicial review mechanisms complicates the demos judicial supremacy issue, and it might vary. I'm no expert on those regimes. There are in the room at least 5 people that I can notice they know much more about it than me. But I will say that in terms of the maybe those transnational bodies and human rights regimes are better politically protected than national high courts in advancing all sorts of agendas. So that does not address the problem of judicial supremacy, but it certainly complicates matters.
I have 5 very provocative words in answer. Judicial supremacy is a myth.
I agree. All right, well, let's thank our panelists for a really provocative beginning. Great job, and I also want to thank the questioners. We now have 15 minutes for coffee break, and I really want to plead with you to come back by 11 o'clock so we can get started. This whole conference is really packed, so we really have to stick on the schedule. I'm sorry I'll be harping on that all day.